Thank you for joining us. We have the pleasure today of interviewing John Micklethwait, editor of The Economist, a promoter of free market ideals since 1843. John, thanks so much for coming today. So John, how much damage has been done to capitalism?
I think it's been damaged much more than it should have been, and that's the big picture. And I think it's been particularly damaged, actually, in what happens in terms of the popular perception. Too many people now look at the world and think that bankers ruined it. Bankers took a system, and we ended up with a system where the profits were all privatized and the risks were all socialized, where the bankers took all the money and then we all had to bail them out. And that's a cliche, and to quite a large extent it's wrong. And I just think there's a big difference between financial capitalism, where there is transparently a problem that needs to be fixed, and capitalism more generally. You know, the basic philosophy of open markets, trade, and a broad freedom of expression, all those things still work. Finance has always had problems. There have always been banking crashes. It's always been an exception, finance. And that's something we need to deal with still, but that doesn't invalidate everything else.
So if you were to list the top one or two things that we're doing right in dealing with the financial crisis and the top one or two things that we are doing wrong right now in dealing with it, what are those? How would you do that?
I think Jane and Joe think the problem is bankers pay. They think the problem is people being able to take all the money out whilst they have to step in and save things. And then the bigger problem is that they are suffering, as they see it, because of all this greed on Wall Street has come back and hit them. So those are the issues in terms of how they see it. In terms of where I see the problems, I think the problems were a lot to do with, some cases, too much regulation. In other cases, yes, there wasn't enough regulation. There wasn't enough regulation. I think everyone could possibly agree of things like credit default swaps. You shouldn't end up with $62 trillion or something without anybody really having them on exchanges. You shouldn't, by the same token, end up with regulation that forces banks to push things off their balance sheets.
So could you elaborate on the role of incentives and how that may have influenced government's decisions?
The incentives went awry. So no, I think incentives went awry in two ways, partly because of what governments did. There's no doubt about that. Governments pushed people into the wrong direction. If you have a system whereby you're allowed to keep some forms of assets on your balance sheet and other ones off, then you're going to tend to put as much of the bad stuff as possible, push it away. If you have systems where you get taxed on a particular thing but not on another one, that's going to tend to push you in a particular direction. I think that's all clear, but I think it's worth, and we have to be honest, throughout financial history there have been manias, crashes, disturbances, and quite a lot of the damage was also sort of self-caused. Bankers did dream up more than one could normally expect a sort of rational man to come up with, and bankers got hurt. People dreamt up these incredible systems and they came back and hit themselves. You look at Lehman Brothers, the staff of Lehman Brothers had a huge amount of their wealth tied up in stock, and they got hurt for this themselves.
So could you highlight for us the top one or two problems that you feel government should be addressing right now and isn't, and perhaps the one or two problems that they're addressing but aren't doing very well?
I think central banks, perhaps belatedly, have sort of done the right thing in bringing down interest rates, and again in going to quantitative easing. So we have pumped a lot of money in. That's the good thing which happened. The bad things are, have we pumped money in the right direction? Did the various of things like quantitative easing, are we doing that precisely the right way? There's some technical questions like that. But the bigger bad thing is, to what extent have we even begun to think about what the consequences of all this are? Now, what are the consequences in terms of how eventually you'd pay that back? And particularly also, what are the things we're not doing? And I still think we haven't really taken out the banking problem. There are all those toxic assets in banks, and they have not been taken off balance sheets. That's still where we are at this precise moment. And we're now, depending how you measure it, 9, 12, maybe 16, 18 months since this thing started. And there is still a lot of rubbish on banks' balance sheets. to some extent, the lesson of all the other crises is that the sooner you get it out, the better it is. You know, this sits there, it befuddles everything else.
So have we created a culture where we're no longer prepared to let a bank fail?
There is a sort of argument coming out of the banks which says, give us a bit more time, we'll make a little bit more money, and in the meantime, that will give us more time to absorb these losses. Well, yes, but it also gives more time. It means the time at which the whole problem begins to be sorted out is put back, and that is having an effect. You know, unemployment is rising. Unemployment is rising. There are fewer people buying things, and that is having a longer-term effect on the banks themselves. And so, to what extent people really think in banks that the answer is just putting stuff off, I think doesn't make sense. It's sort of Japan against Sweden. Sweden, Scandinavia sorted out their banks quickly, brutally in some cases, and it did work. Japan didn't, and you ended up with a lost decade. The question about what sort of bank do you think we should permanently underwrite? And the answer at the moment is we've inherited this problem where we have to carry them. You know, it's the problem of inheritance almost. This is a problem we've got and we have to deal with.
So who is showing political leadership right now in terms of creating a culture and an investment climate that is going to be positive in terms of getting their country or region out of the financial crisis?
I don't see much sign of any politicians really at the moment necessarily blowing the trumpet of free market because they're free markets, because, and it's a source of deep regret to me and probably Fraser Institute as well, it's that there is not many votes in that particular strategy. Again, sadly in some ways. So from that perspective, I think it's the politicians who can limit the amount of damage which, again, you know, we will harry them and tell it's wrong, but that damage which is inevitable. So it is the ones who don't necessarily jack up their tax rates to enormous amounts. It's the ones who find different ways of being able to deal with this. It's the ones who perhaps deal with the problems to do with toxic loans quickest. So I don't see it very much, and this is a rather horrific way to look at it. I don't see it as this is an era of saints. I see this as, you know, the prizes will go to those who sin least.
And so what over the last year has been the biggest surprise for you?
I think one surprise for me, and again I think it's important that people register that something they thought didn't work as well as it should have done, is securitization. I genuinely thought securitization was a no-brainer. You know, what could be wrong with the idea of banks creating assets and getting them out of the door as quickly as possible? Because that was a way of getting stuff off the balance sheet of the bank. It's a way of it ending up with the sort of end investors as quickly as possible rather than hanging around a bank's balance sheet. I suppose I always knew there was one flaw with it, which is I always knew that a bank which is creating an asset to sell is not going to spend as much time looking at it as one which is going to hang on to it. The bit I didn't know and perhaps should have thought about harder is the degree to which people created these assets, split them up, diced them, cut them, did all the different ways. And then I assumed those were being sold on to people. I genuinely thought when the main problem to do with banks and loans came up, that actually a lot of the problem would be in some distant, you know, pension fund in Alberta or a investment management firm in Edinburgh or insurance company in Nice would end up with actually a slice of this stuff which they bought. In fact, a lot of it had gone out of the bank's front doors and come in the back, and that was a surprise to me.
So John, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today. We really appreciate your visit. Thank you. And that's it for this edition of Fraser TV. I'm Leah Costello. Thanks for watching.